Hello and welcome to this Centre for Student Success Research Support webinar. My name is Victoria O'Donnell and I'm the Director of Research Development and Academic Enhancement for Laureate, and I work with the Liverpool online programmes. The first thing we're going to do is just make sure that we're all clear about what we mean by theory. So a theory is not something which is a specific instance of a problem or a phenomenon, but a theory is a set of ideas, a system of ideas, concepts, constructs and principles which try to explain something. So a theory tries to explain something at the level of general principles that are independent of a specific instance of the thing that's to be explained. So for example, if we were interested in understanding why students perform more poorly in examinations than they do in other forms of assessment, we might use theories of stress or the impact of heightened arousal on cognitive functioning. We might also want to use or refer to theories of context-dependent memory to explain that recall and remembering is better if it happens in a situation that's similar to the situation in which the information was originally learned. But these theories are not about exams, they're not about students, they're not about learning specifically. They're a system of ideas and principles and relationships that explain at a general level that's independent of the particular example that we're talking about. So it's important to use theory because theory moves us beyond just the observation of the problem itself or the phenomenon that we see in the social world. Theories help us to understand and explain what's going on. They help us to predict what would happen in the future. And so it's important that we're moving away from just observation and the question of what happens at master's level, particularly in your final research project, towards explanations of how and why things happen. And that's where theory can help. So in your dissertation, theory might feature somewhere as paradigm, as a lens, or as new knowledge. And in this webinar, I'm going to talk through each of those three things in turn. And then finally, we're going to finish by looking at what would that mean for your research. So theory may feature in your dissertation as a paradigm. Theory as paradigm will underpin the design of your research. It may do this by impacting upon or influencing your ontology, your epistemology, your methodology, or your specific methods. So let's talk about what those four things mean and how theory might impact upon them. When we talk about ontology, we're talking about fundamental questions about existence and what it is that we think exists. What do we believe is out there in the world? Fundamental questions about the nature of the social world and how it relates to individuals lead us to ask, is there something out there that we can measure independently of the observer? So can the colour of the sky be established objectively? Or is the colour of the sky always going to be influenced by our visual systems? Is there some way that we can say what colour it is without needing to go through the lens of the human perceptual system? Or is the world constructed by people inevitably in their particular historical, cultural and social contexts? If we're studying teaching, can we objectively say whether a particular class has been taught well or not? Can we measure good teaching in an objective way? Can we observe good teaching independently? Or do we have to ask the students whether the teaching has been good? Is it possible that the same teaching could be experienced as good or bad by different learners in the same classroom? So ontology forces us to ask and question ourselves about the nature of existence and what we think is out there in the world. And it inevitably then impacts upon how we're going to design our research, because depending on what we think is out there and how it can be measured is going to affect how we can then design a project. And so it's intrinsically linked to what we call epistemology. Once we've established our ontological position, we can then think about what our epistemological position is going to be. And epistemology is about what makes for valid and reliable knowledge of the world. So once we've established what our ontological position is and what we think exists, what would then make for valid and reliable knowledge about that world? So again, we have two sort of different positions often in terms of epistemology. Sometimes we take an objective view where we would focus on observing phenomena that we can see, that we can record, that we can measure. And other times, if we're taking a more subjective approach, then we would focus on interpretations of meaning. If we think that what exists is fundamentally constructed by people, then their constructions of meaning have to be the mechanism by which we generate knowledge about the world. So based on our ontology and our epistemology, we would then move on to think about methodology in research design. Methodology is the study of how research is done. How do we get reliable and valid knowledge of the world, however we think that world exists? What are the strategies that our inquiry should take? Depending on our ontology and our epistemology, we may take a deductive approach to methodology. Alternatively, we may take an inductive approach. Induction typically means you beginning with the data, the observations, and working our way towards theory through a recognition of the patterns or themes that emerge from the data itself. Whereas deduction implies a more objective approach. We begin with pre-specified closed, outcome-oriented research questions or hypotheses that we then set out to test. And so this leads us to a consideration of whether it's going to be appropriate for us to adopt qualitative methodologies or quantitative methodologies or mixed methodologies. But these will follow from our considerations of ontology and epistemology. And then, once we've arrived at an understanding of what our methodological approach is going to be, we can decide upon the very specific methods that we will use. The methods themselves are the actual specific tools or approaches that we're going to implement. So we might decide that the most appropriate approach, based on our belief that there is an objective world out there and that epistemologically we would then be focused on observable, recordable phenomena, we might design an experiment taking that kind of approach. We might use psychometric tests, or alternatively we might move towards qualitative methods like interviews or focus groups. We might use questionnaires, and they can be qualitative or quantitative in terms of the data that they would generate. We may use observation. These are the particular methods, and it's important to make sure that the methods that you choose evolve from a consideration of your ontology, your epistemology, and your methodology. So we've talked about theory as paradigm and how theory might influence your dissertation through its impact on your research design. Now let's move on to thinking about theory as a lens. There's lots of theories out there. Think about the existing ones that you know about, that you're familiar with, that you've read up on. What's important about a theory and what makes a good theory is that it has explanatory power, that it has the ability to move you beyond just understanding what is happening in a particular situation or context. to being able to offer an explanation about why that's happening and how it's happening. Think about the example I gave earlier of wanting to understand good teaching, successful teaching. I'm going to talk now about how theories of learning might be used as a lens on that particular question, how theories of leadership might be used, and then we'll talk about where the different directions are that the lens could be pointing in your dissertation. Once I start reading about learning, I discover that there are many theories of learning. Theories of learning offer us explanations for how learning occurs and why it happens in certain situations and not others. And there are so many different theories that all have their own ideas about this. There's no single theory of learning. So, for example, I might read about behaviourism, which argues that the focus in learning is on predefined, measurable goals, that learning is performative. It's about externally observable behaviours and things that we do. And so successful teaching then should focus on enabling the performance or the outward behaviours that are considered successful. On the other hand, constructivism focuses on the internal construction of knowledge and understanding through individual meaning making, that successful learning requires an individual to be able to make sense of things, to assimilate new information and accommodate it in with their existing knowledge and understanding until they build a greater understanding of it. It has to be meaningful and constructed internally. Social constructivism emphasises the role of social interaction, relationships, discourse, dialogue, people around us for successful learning. And theories that talk about deep and surface learning emphasise different ways in which information can be taken in at a superficial level versus a deep level, and the more successful learning focuses on the deep level assimilation of information. All of these different theories have bodies of evidence to support them. There are research studies that support all of these different theories. Some of these theories are classic, are older historically. Some of them are more modern, more contemporary. In my research, then, I have to work out which of these theories is most relevant, which makes more sense in the context of the research that I'm doing or the questions that I'm asking, which seem less relevant. Is there a way in which I can say that one theory or another is better or worse than another? Every project will be different. A theory that's really appropriate for your research might not be appropriate for somebody else's. So it's important to recognise that these theories are not necessarily better or worse than one another, but that some of them might have more potential for explanatory power in the context of your study. In a different context or within a different discipline, I might be more interested in theories of leadership to explain learning. In professional contexts, for example. And I discover once again that there are many, many theories of leadership, explanations for how and why certain people make successful leaders. And this might impact upon why, in certain contexts, learners will learn from a teacher and in others they won't. There are trait theories of leadership that emphasise personality characteristics of individual people and how important these are in influencing successful leadership. There are contingency theories which, in contrast, emphasise the environment, the context, that no single style of leadership will ever be good in every single situation because it's dependent upon the situation itself. There are relationship theories of leadership that emphasise the significance for successful leaders of the maintenance and formation of successful relationships with the people that they're influencing. And then there are management theories, which focus much more on the planning and organisation within corporate settings and the role that these play in making successful leaders. But once again, there are bodies of evidence to support all of these theories of leadership. There's no single theory which is right or wrong. Some are, again, older than others, some are more contemporary, some may be more or less relevant in terms of the work that I want to do for my dissertation. And it's part of the work of my dissertation to work out which of these theories is going to have most explanatory power. And that's what would make one of these theories or better or worse for the purposes of my dissertation, is how much explanatory power it has. So these theories all give us a different way of looking at the same thing. They provide a lens, a different lens, that enables us to see things slightly differently depending on which theoretical lens we're using. But then there's also the question of where in your dissertation is that lens pointing? Because it may be that your theoretical lens is going to be pointing at a practice-based phenomenon, problem or challenge that you've identified, perhaps in your workplace or somewhere else, that's going to be the focus of your dissertation. And the theoretical framework that you've decided is most relevant will help you to explain that phenomenon, will offer you an explanation for why this thing is a problem, why it's a challenge. Alternatively, your theory may be a lens that you can point at the extant literature that you've reviewed. It may be that having read lots and lots of different articles and book chapters about the subject that you're interested in, that a particular theory allows you to explain what you've read, allows you to offer a new way of looking at the existing literature. Or alternatively, it may be that you use the lens towards the end of your dissertation to interpret your research findings, that the theoretical lens points at your results and helps you to explain what it is that you've found. So the theory that you choose, or the multiple theories that you choose because they're relevant to your dissertation, can point at different parts of that dissertation and have impact in different ways. And so the fourth way in which theory might have a place in your dissertation is that it may manifest as new knowledge. And that new knowledge could be your adaptation or revision of an existing theory. It may be that over the course of your final research project, you may identify that a particular theory has lots of explanatory power, but stops short of explaining everything that you've found. So you may propose an adaptation, a change or a revision to an existing theory in order to explain new findings. Alternatively, it may be that your research confirms an existing theory, and that in itself can represent new knowledge, that we have new evidence that this existing theory is powerful and continues to have explanatory power in the field. It could be that a particular piece of research leads to the generation of a completely new, novel theory, but that's unlikely in the context of a master's research project. But it's possible that theory can manifest in a research project through the generation of a completely new theory. But whichever one of these applies to you, it will require justification in the light of existing theory. So you will need to be able to talk knowledgeably about the existing theories that are relevant to your field in order to demonstrate why an adaptation or revision is necessary, in order to demonstrate that you can confirm this existing theory, in order to demonstrate how what you've come up with is a new theory. So existing theory will have to play a part in your dissertation, irrespective of whether you ultimately conclude that a particular theory has utility or not. And so finally, what will this mean for our research? Well, the question is, I suppose, how is your dissertation going to be theoretically informed? Every dissertation is different. Perhaps you can also already see ways in which theory is going to occupy one, two, or all three places in your dissertation. Perhaps it's going to be informing your research design. Perhaps it's going to be acting as a lens through which you explain the literature that you've read, or through which you explain the professional challenge that you're facing, or through which you explain the results that you've generated. Perhaps you've adapted an existing theory, or you've created a new one. It doesn't necessarily have to be the case that theory features in all of these different ways, but it's certainly the case that theory will appear somewhere. And that's because its place is to bring explanatory power, which we've said all through this webinar, moving you beyond just describing what you see or describing what is happening, to a place where you've really achieved that master's level ability to critique and evaluate, to offer explanations, to predict and to optimize what's going on. That's what really makes a final research project master's level quality, is moving it beyond the mere description towards the critical and the evaluative.